Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a few moments for other all attendees to join, so then we'll kick off. But nice to see you all. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll kick off. And those later will be able to still be who join us later will still hopefully be able to get to grips. So thanks everyone for joining today. The genesis of this call is a lot of research we've done here at More in Common around infrastructure development and whether it be housing, energy, transport, and how local concern about that can be managed and how you know, projects can be designed in a way which maximizes their support among local people. And today we'll touch on some themes of community benefit, the planning process, and how as policymakers or businesses or developers you can design a process which best boosts confidence in the system. So I will pull up some slides now and we'll work through them. And I believe there should be a chat function. So if you have any questions throughout, then please drop them in the chat and I'll make sure to answer them. Hopefully you can all see my slide. I'll go uh, into presentation mode. Yeah, so thank you. So the first thing I would like to flag to you is that I'm going to take this in two sides of this webinar. The first of all, we just got a bit of quantitative polling about attitudes towards development and the role that infrastructure concerns can play. And then secondly, I will take you through the insights I picked up from a deep dive I did into attitudes towards grid infrastructure along the East Coast and how designing an effective consultation process and an effective community benefit scheme could help take the staunch opposition there and turn it into support for the infrastructure projects. So the first one to talk about is just how important a role infrastructure plays in driving local opposition to development. So often in Britain, and don't worry, you'll have the slides shared with you after this presentation, so you don't need to take it all in now. But often in Britain, there is this, increasingly in our politics, there is this divide between NIMBYs and YIMBYs. On the one hand, YIMBYs believe that everything should be built everywhere, perhaps. And the characterization of NIMBYs would be that they are opposed to any development in any form. But what we actually find is most people sit in the middle. They're neither necessarily opposed or supportive of developments, and it's dependent on the context. And what we find is when it comes to looking at housing specifically, is that infrastructure and the pressure on services is one of the biggest causes of concern. So what we see on this chart on the left is that about 17% of people would fall into that perhaps NIMBY bracket in that they would oppose any new development in their local area. 26% fall into that perhaps YIMBY bracket in that they would support any new development, but half are in that middle ground. And if you look at, perhaps more negative or more positive types of development, I'd like to draw your attention to this bit here. So 68% of people say that would oppose a development in their local area if it did not come with the supporting infrastructure. Whereas 68% say they would be supportive of or at least not oppose a development in the area if it was accompanied by the community infrastructure. And this cuts across basically all of our 7 segments and more in common. So hopefully you're all familiar with our 7 segments, but these are basically core values-based segments. And for all of our 7 segments, they would be in opposition to housing development if it didn't have any supporting infrastructure. And the reason why I start off this webinar with a focus on this is that when you get into discussions on development and housing in focus groups, it's really clear that one of the biggest, if not the driver of concern in most cases when it comes to new housing and new development is the pressure it's going to create on local services. And people feel like that housing and development takes place and none of the supporting infrastructure accompanies it. So as a policymaker and as a developer, it leads to a very important conclusion that community infrastructure levy funds actually have a huge role to play in assuaging concerns about development, because it's not that people are opposed to any form of housing being built in their area, but rather they believe that if housing is built alone, then it'll bring negative consequences. So I can't stress how important, getting the community infrastructure levy right is for any form of development. And, if you're trying to build support for development, that is probably should be one of your core focuses. And we'll touch on a bit more detail using the specific examples of the grid infrastructure, how you might go about doing that. These are just some more quotes, but everywhere you go in the country, they'll say the same thing: is that I don't have a problem with housing, but the problem is they don't build the stuff that comes around it, and they have real concerns with the planning system and how it delivers that. So, having introduced a bit of quantitative evidence for you, I just also wanted to, the focus of this webinar will be on our deeper dive into the specifics of energy infrastructure in particular. So what we did was we did 4 focus groups in places up where pylons are being built and where there has been some local opposition to pylons being built up and down the country. You'll see it's these sort of arrows indicate where the residents in the focus groups are from. So you can see all along the East Coast, and I'll just show you in a bit more detail. So we did 4 groups, and these groups took place in March and April last year. And because of that, they were recruited based on our previous segmentation. So we updated our segment late last year with Shattered Britain, our Shattered Britain report. So we did 4 focus groups, and we wanted to go to the areas which were most affected by these pylons. So where the pylon infrastructure is already being built or about to be built. Because what I've found in previous research is that generally people have very different views on this infrastructure when it's in their own neck of the woods. So we did 4 groups. We did one in Aberdeenshire. That was of backbone conservatives, sort of, your traditional Shire conservatives. Some very interesting dynamics, particularly in the Scotland context, given that they are much closer to where the energy is being generated. We did a group in Waveney Valley of our established Liberals. You may know Waveney Valley was captured by the Green Party at the last election on a very strong anti-pylon ticket. We went to Boston, where there has been very strong local opposition to the pylons there, and where Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform, won at the last election. And then we went to Scunthorpe, an archetypal constituency in the Red Wall, with its own energy story, given that the circumstances surrounding British Steel. In Scunthorpe, actually, Scunthorpe's a bit of an interesting one because it's a town itself, but surrounded by Greenbelt, and the pylons, proposed pylons, will go on the outskirts of Scunthorpe. So we'll go in a bit more detail, but what were the key research findings? So first of all, and this perhaps won't surprise you, is that opposition to the grid was strongest amongst those who live closest to it. So, and I'll give you an example. So in Scunthorpe, the pylons are being built maybe 10, 15 kilometers away from where people live. There's really much weaker awareness that this was happening or opposition. But in the other areas, there was visceral opposition to the development of this infrastructure. It was one of the angriest focus groups, some of the angriest focus groups I've done. So real emotional anger at the development of this infrastructure. And it was there was a real strong fairness angle to this because these people felt that their local areas were being destroyed and they weren't getting any benefit from it. So, how can you mitigate that and I think that's why community benefits plays a really important role in that how can you address that concern that you're having this infrastructure built in your area and you're reaping none of the rewards. When it comes to community benefits, there's not a one fits all solutions, but there's some key principles that we can do to make sure that development and community benefits maximizes support for infrastructure. There is almost no confidence in the consultation process, and that is driving a limited willingness to engage with consultation. So don't take a lack of engagement as people not caring. They just don't think it makes any difference if they do participate. And crucially, and I think this is really important for communicators, is that actually when you look at grid infrastructure, these arguments and these opinions are being formed about local issues. They're not relevant to the national debate. So arguing that grid infrastructure is necessary for net zero and is necessary for energy security will do little to persuade people of the merits of having it in their local area, because fundamentally the opposition is not being driven by national concerns, it's being driven by the local area. So to touch on the opposition to grid infrastructure and pylons. So across all four groups, there was a sense of really strong opposition to this grid infrastructure. And in my view, it felt very emotional and one full of frustration, because basically the participants thought, everyone in my local area is opposed to this, or there's strong opposition to local area, but it doesn't matter. And no matter what we do, this is going to be built anywhere with the negative impacts on the local area. So there's a sense of anger, frustration, and resignation. And it really cut through. This was a really salient issue. And one can see why, when it comes to like a local election or a general election, why people running an anti-pylon campaigns can have such great success, because there is real anger and opposition to this in these local communities. And something I thought was interesting, and I really tried to push on this, is that often when you see pylons and infrastructure being debated in the media or in local politics or national politics, you will see opposition being presented through the lens of environmentalism. And we really tried to push on that. But actually what we found was more when people meant the environment, it wasn't about nature or wildlife or green spaces. It was about the visual environment. And across our four groups, the only group where we really saw opposition being driven by nature and environment and wildlife was in Boston, where there was real strong concern about local bird populations and the nature reserve that might be impacted there. So it's not necessarily that people oppose this on environmental grounds. It's much more about visual landscape and the amenities and the beauty of national area, and not, wildlife and landscapes. And this is, I think, probably one of the most important takeaways from our research that we did in these four areas, is that each of these areas viewed these things through local lens. But one of the core principles that united them in their views and the opposition was a sense of unfairness. And basically, it's as simple as our areas are being destroyed by this infrastructure and we're getting nothing in return. So my favorite anecdote was that I'll share with you, is that we did these groups up and from the north of the East Coast down to the south of the East Coast. And in Aberdeenshire, they said, look, we're having all this energy infrastructure being built in Scotland and our area, but all the energy is going down south to England. And then in the northeast of England, in Lincolnshire and Scunthorpe, they said, we're having all of this being built in our area, but it's the South Midlands, the south of England, who are benefiting from this. And in East Anglia, in Waveney Valley, they said, we're having all this being built in East Anglia, but it's only people in London benefiting. So throughout this, there is a sense that we are the ones bearing the cost and others are getting the rewards. And that makes people really angry and makes people feel it's really unfair that this is happening. And it lends itself to an argument around community benefits and how it can address that. Um, and I thought also, and perhaps this is something I would like to explore further, is that in Scunthorpe and Boston, the more deprived parts of the countries of areas that we focused on, there's also this sense that people in power just didn't care about the areas. They thought they could get away with destroying Boston and Scunthorpe because no one would care, whereas they felt that, more affluent parts of the country, this would never happen because, people wouldn't be willing to destroy the countryside, or in their eyes, in sort of Surrey perhaps, because people would be up in arms there. But sort of the more poorer and more deprived parts of the country, it was fair play to do so. And finally, the other thing which drove the sense of unfairness is that the motivations for these pylons, people were basically of the view across our groups that these could be built underground, and they wouldn't be built underground, not because of valid reasons, but solely because of the profits and private interest of the energy companies responsible for this infrastructure development. So you can see this sense of unfairness is really at the heart of the opposition and the local opposition to this infrastructure. So as I've set up, so basically, if we see this through a lens of unfairness, and if you're an economist, basically people having to bear the externalities of this infrastructure development in their area, but reaping no reward or compensation for it, it lends itself to community benefits playing a really important role in mitigating this opposition or bringing people from opposition to support. So I'll just take you through what we found when we explored in community benefits, because in these groups we explored top-line attitudes towards the developments, but also did a really big deep dive into community benefits in the consultation process. So first of all, when we introduced this concept of community benefits in all four groups, the first response was this is a bribe. What you're proposing is just trying to bribe us into forgetting the reasons why we oppose development. And basically making sure that if you are trying to make sure community benefits are going to maximize their support, ensuring that you're not being seen to bribe people will be essential. And I'll touch on a bit more detail on how you might do that shortly. But yeah, their bribery accusation came across every single group. But saying that, I thought it was a very fascinating, something that shocked me and surprised me, was how transactional residents were in response to this. So they basically said, look, you are bribing us, but I actually would obviously welcome the idea of a bribe because, if something's bad has happening to our area, we deserve something good in return. So yes, I see it as a bribe, but actually they took a highly transactional approach to this. So I don't think alone it can convert opposition to support, but I think it can really help reduce the salience or to reduce the strength of opposition to infrastructure development, because it reduces the sense that people are getting a raw deal. And they're happy to take that sort of approach because they have a very transactional view of things. The one thing I would really flag to you, and I think this is really important for government as it approaches this, is we tested, obviously, so for those who aren't so familiar with grid infrastructure in itself, the government's got a policy of I don't know if it's confirmed it or was just consulting on it, of offering, I believe, everyone who lives within a kilometre of a pylon a £250 discount a year on their energy bills for 10 years. And I think this could do more harm than good to local opposition to energy infrastructure. Because firstly, two core reasons here. Firstly, people thought the amount offered of £250 a year was actually an insult because basically lots of them people said, our area is being ruined. Maybe my house price is diminished, but more broadly, our area is being harmed, and you're trying to pay us £250 a year to make that up. And it actually, really insulted people more than it gained their support. And equally, unless the government is willing to devote huge resources to such an energy bill discount scheme, the scope of people who are going to be benefiting from it is really going to be quite minimal. So when we tested the 1 kilometer, that also really backfired because they said, look, I can see it I live over a kilometer away. I can see it because I think, these obviously are largely being built in areas of the countryside where, a kilometer is not the same. It doesn't capture as many people as it does in the city. And I think it really risks creating particularly like divisions in the local community between those who do get the payment and those who don't, and creating resentment because, people feel like they're being ruined, but their neighbors are, and they're not receiving anything, but their neighbors are. And that really then creates even more perceptions of unfairness because, not only are they having something bad to them and getting enough in return, someone who lives down the road is actually getting something that they're not. So I would be very cautious of believing that bill discounts are the way forward on this issue. Presenting the public, so presenting these focus groups with the trade-off of, look, there's only a fixed amount of money, so either you make the criteria broader about who benefits, or you bring the bill discounts lower, or you increase the size of the bill discounts and you reduce the number of people eligible for it. And across our groups, there was a real sense that people would prefer that the thing that's broader and everyone benefits from because they saw it as much fairer and would mean that everyone who's impacted would benefit. And I think there's something here we could get into wider research about how people perceive large numbers and spending. If I was to have £20 million in spending on discounts or benefits, I would be very strongly moving towards a situation where that's about pooled shared community benefits, because even though, you can make the argument that if you do build, a nice community centre or a new nature reserve, the per capita spending is less than £250, people don't see it through that lens. So I would really push people, and our participants really made it clear that they would much prefer that pooling this benefits and pooling this funding to give assets that could be shared by the community. What also came clear, and this won't surprise people, hopefully, is that there is little to no confidence in any form of institution in this country, really, when it comes to politics. So there was real concern that the council would, A, be able to manage this effectively and get the community benefits, but B, know where to spend it. People thought that the council would just spend it on stuff, their own pet projects, stuff that they wanted to spend it on anyway, and not what would actually help the community. So there was quite a strong consensus across our groups that actually what would be really important in community benefits is ensuring that this funding is allocated in a way which where the local residents have a strong decision influence over the decision-making process. So how can you make sure that local people are deciding where the money goes because they believe that they know best compared to the council who don't really understand what their local area needs. So making sure that local communities are involved in the allocation and decision-making where community benefits are spent will be really important. And I'll just come back on this as well, is that the other point I would make is when it comes to the beneficiaries is that building on this very highly transactional area that approach this that I spoke about earlier, you shouldn't assume that community benefits should be spent on mitigation of the projects, because one might argue, and I thought this was interesting, that if people's concerns are about environment and nature, that they want any community benefits to be spent about mitigating the impact of the projects on the environment and nature. What we actually found was that that people, because of this transactional approach, were basically not, we need to mitigate this impact of this bad project, but this bad project's happening to me, therefore we need something good in return. So they were much more focused on like funding stuff they wanted independently of this energy infrastructure than perhaps mitigating the actual development. So I guess as a planning process and a policymakers, it's actually, you don't necessarily, community benefits doesn't have to be focused as a mitigation. It can actually just be a benefit and positive because that's what people want. They want something good in return for having to deal with the negative and the damage that the infrastructure is going to cause to their area. So, my key recommendations would therefore on community benefits is that first of all, there's no one size fits all. So even within groups, people couldn't reach a conclusion about what they wanted the funding to be spent on. So there, you can't say what's going to work in every part of the country. You need to look at the local specific context and because it will depend. So there's no one thing I don't think that will come out on top. Early timing is key. So there's a sense that this community benefits is just bribing people, and often it's that because they hear about this development, there is this infrastructure and there's plans go through, and then there's a discussion about community benefits. I would really push people to ensure that community benefits are included at the very start of the development process. So rather than seeing it as a post-bribe to mitigate opposition, they're seen as a package of addressing this unfairness throughout the process. I've touched on this, so I won't go into too much more, but you need to design these benefits in a way that mitigates against low trust. So trust is low that are in government to deliver, in business to deliver, in everything. So first of all, make sure that people have a say to feed into what is being funded. And second of all, really front loading this stuff because, we really picked this up that the sense that there's been broken promises before where people always promised when development and infrastructure happens that there will be benefits for them, but those are never realized. So really try and front load these benefits because, if people know that this is going to happen in a year or two, they're much more likely to believe you than if you say it's going to happen in 20 years because they just think you'll break your promises and it will never happen. And then, as I said earlier, fairness rather than mitigation is the key. So this is a transactional thing, So people believe something is bad is happening, therefore want something good. It does not need to focus on mitigation. So don't necessarily believe that you need to be focusing on nature and wildlife as you design community benefits. Giving people improved bus services can be just as impactful, if not more impactful, at getting them to support the infrastructure. Even if it actually has nothing to do with the actual impact of the infrastructure. So moving on from community benefits and then towards the consultation process. So another thing we explored was how can you use deliberation and consultation to build support for this? The starting point was that, first of all, as I'm sure you'll be unsurprised by, there is huge apathy to engage with consultation. So like in our groups, basically very few people had engaged with consultations or plan to do so. But this isn't necessarily because they don't think consultation matters. They do think consultation matters and it matters deeply that people feel they have a chance to share their views and concerns on the infrastructure. So just because they don't participate doesn't mean they think consultation is not important. And why, if they care and believe consultation is important, don't they participate? And the clear and dominant reason why is that they don't believe that consultations impact the outcomes. So this was the case across all four of our groups, and we see it across any research we do when it comes to planning, infrastructure, and development. Basically, they believe that these consultation processes are just PR exercises. They're just window dressing. No matter what local people say, people will do whatever they want anyway. So what's the point of participating in a consultation process with a fixed outcome? Yeah, so I mean, that's why people aren't participating and why they feel cynical about these processes. So in itself, consultation won't solve the problem. And part of this is that, either themselves or they see across the nation, they've had very negative experiences of consultation. So they believe past experiences where they've submitted a consultation response and the local people have voiced their concerns and then just being completely ignored are what's driving this lack of confidence in the consultation process. So locally, people spoke about how other consultation process they've seen in the area and how this has happened. But also nationally, people looked at HS2 where despite the local opposition, people it just basically got built anyway, and people ploughed ahead with it. And I would say that, and I think this is where people, like normal people, differentiate themselves from planning and policy experts, is that people see consultation as being an instrumental value. So, there isn't value in just asking people for their views. There is value in asking people for their views and then bearing them in mind and taking them on board. So people like consultations where they feel like they've achieved and changed the outcome. So how do you do this? How do you design a consultation process which basically leverages the potential opportunity to get support for these developments and infrastructure from local people in a context where they basically don't trust them as a starting point? So I'm going to throw some key principles at you, and then I'll go into depth in a bit more detail. So the first thing, and these four points is, first point is consult on what you actually want to know, because often I see developers, house builders, local authorities, energy companies asking a range of questions where they will canvass local people and they will then completely disregard what they have to say. And I would say asking people for their views and then ignoring them is actively more harmful than not asking them at all. So if you know that you're going to build this energy infrastructure or this is going to be built, don't ask them whether they support or oppose the development, because doing so will do nothing to build public support if you then proceed with it, because they want to know that actually their consultation matters, and actually it really frustrates them and irritates them more if they've gone through a consultation process, the local people have said one thing, and then people just proceeded with what they want to anyway. So it just reinforces all of their prides and their mistrust in the consultation process. So do not consult on stuff you don't want to actually hear people's views on. Like, you need to ask yourselves, why are we consulting? What do we want to know? And then build from that, and then go from there. So second of all, a way to do this is that people understand that these are, in pretend it comes to energy infrastructure, is that these are big national projects, and therefore they don't necessarily believe or feel that they should be asked about the national level. But what they do know, and they do feel extremely strongly, is that they know more about their local areas than any politician or any council based at town hall, or energy company based in London or what have you. And what they want to be asked on, and what they want to be incorporated into the process, is that the local expertise they have. So, for example, look, they know that this infrastructure is going to be built, but what they know is that actually in one field, there's actually a great walking route where people walk their dog. So if the pylon was built 250 meters to the left so that they could still use their walking route, then that would be great. And that would really make a difference to how much it impacts their lives. That's the sort of stuff they want to be feeding in, the stuff that you guys don't know already, and can really shape the process. So what do you actually want to ask about? It should be the stuff, the local expertise that they have that you don't know, and they want to share that to help inform stuff. Thirdly, how do you address this lack of confidence in the consultation process? So I would argue that a key part of it should be that you respond to people's responses, because currently people feel like they make a consultation response and it goes nowhere and it's never read, it's not listened to. What really helped in explaining and building confidence in the consultation process in our groups was that a sense that their views were being bared in mind. And one of the best ways to do this would be that they proposed was that if they had a response to their response, and they acknowledge that it can't necessarily be an individual response, but if they say, here's what we think, and you decide to not bear that in mind or to do something different, explaining to them why you have not taken their view on board would do a huge world of benefit for you if in building trust and benefits and support through the consultation process. Finally, I would say, and it's a classic thing we say at More in Common, is you need to meet people where they are. So very few people know how a consultation process works or how to participate. Often they thought that you had to go to meetings or, go to the town hall. And so if you want people to engage with the consultation process and to deliver trust and build trust through that, then you really need to reach out to them where they are. So, sending letters to them and with forms so that they can fill it out and do it directly. Having QR codes or doing adverts online so you can hear their views. People will not know how to find the consultation process. So you need to bring it to them so that it's easier for them to fill out and to feel like they're being asked and that they know it's taking place. Often, like these people spoke about not knowing that consultation process were taking place or had even occurred. So I won't necessarily repeat too much on this because I think hopefully I've covered all of this already, but there's a bit more detail and a few more quotes to build on this in the slides that you'll be shared. So yes, and I'll just say on this point is we asked in the focus groups whether they would prefer a more narrow consultation just on local issues and local expertise or a wider consultation on the bigger questions or whether they should be built, this infrastructure should be built in the first place. And they generally said that they would prefer a narrow consultation because they just know that what they say about whether the pylon should be built full stop is not really going to be taken on board. So actually, having a consultation where things are up for grabs and things haven't already been decided is really important. Oh, I've gone. So, sorry, I think I've copied the same section twice there, so I'll apologize for that. So, my conclusion to you, and then hopefully people can put questions in the chat, and I'll come and ask specific stuff, is what should you be conscious of as decision makers? And looking this through the lens of grid infrastructure, but from the research we do in housing and development more broadly, it has read across a variety of infrastructure and development. So first of all, there is deep anger at this grid infrastructure proposals, and there's deep anger in a variety of infrastructure proposals in this country. It's extremely challenging to switch people from outright opposition to outright support. But what I think you can do is get a huge amount of more buy-in into the project if you engage in a community benefits and a consultation process that's effective and well designed. And community benefits can play a really important role in addressing this opposition. And the reason why is that they shift this paradigm or viewpoint in the eyes of local people that something bad is happening to them and they're getting nothing good in return. Because fundamentally, that's what is driving this opposition to infrastructure. And if I can leave you with more than anything, it's that view that you need to understand, and your communications and your policy and your design need to address that weakness, that something's bad is happening to these people's local areas and they get nothing in return. And community benefits inherently, obviously, can play a big role in that. Window dressing won't cut it. So not only will a PR exercise where you consult on people and then do nothing to take their views on board make no impact on increasing support for the local area, I would generally posit from speaking to these areas and these people in these areas that it actually makes things worse because it irritates them and angers them that you have their viewpoints and their ideas and you're ignoring them and overlooking them. So I think it actually makes it worse. So ultimately, I'm not saying that deliberation can solve these challenges alone, and believing that consultation in itself can solve these challenges isn't necessarily a viewpoint, because actually what we found in these groups, where we asked people how opposed they were before the groups and then at the end, and what we found is actually opposition hardened. So I think sometimes policymakers and businesses and developers assume that explaining more, like people just are opposed to this infrastructure because they don't understand it, and more information and more knowledge will do more will just solve their concerns. It's an information problem or a misunderstanding. It's not. And assuming that providing more information alone will make people more supportive, not the case. It can actually make people more hardened in their opposition. So yeah. So I will stop sharing screens, and I think we have some time for some questions. So I would just ask if people could if you have any questions, then there is a chat function, I believe, or a Q&A function. Pardon? Do I need to open it? Sorry. There's both. Okay, so please use if you have any questions or comments or thoughts that you'd like me to dig on a bit more detail, then please just put them in the Q&A and chat function of the chat. Or if not, then we can call it a day. But yeah, happy to take any questions on what people might have. Can people ask questions about something? We've got no questions, which is unusual. So if there's no questions the next minute or so, then I might close the call and let you enjoy some time back on your lunchtime. I'll leave it a minute. See if there's any questions. Okay, no question. Oh, here we go. Okay, so someone's asked, are there different messages that can be given for different segments that may help garner support? It's a very good question. I would generally say, broadly, I would say no. I would say no, actually. So Johnny's asked that question. I would say not really, because what we found in our research, we did these different segments of the public, and these attitudes towards this grid infrastructure is not being driven by core values or like wider national approaches. It's very local circumstances. So, whilst there are different messages you can give at the national level about why this grid infrastructure development should take place, people aren't seeing it through the lens of whether the grid infrastructure should happen. They're seeing about whether it should happen in their local area. So generally, I think it's not actually, need to be as segmented as we would normally advise, and we can say at the national level, because it's really about people's local area. What I would say perhaps is where you should lean into different parts of what I've proposed to you, in that so two aspects that I think our segments analysis can really be really helpful is where our segments may differ and where it may impact the local consideration is on first of all, the trust in the system. So for some of our segments, like our dissenting disruptors or rooted patriots, are more anti-system segments. So the people who are disproportionately supporting the Reform Party or Reform voters, their lack of trust in the system is even more acute than for other people. So when I spoke earlier about designing a community consultation process or a community benefit process which mitigates low trust, I would really lean into local decision making and local empowerment among those people, because they're even more low trust than the sort of our more established liberals or progressive segments as well. So where people are low in anti-institution, then you really need to lean into where you need to lean into the measures to improve confidence in the allocation of benefits and consultation. So, for example, in Boston and Scunthorpe, that's going to be much more relevant than perhaps in Waveney Valley, which is a bit more affluent and pro-system. Secondly, I would say that the sense of unfairness and being screwed over, there's differences in the different types of segments. So if you're talking to sort of in leafy Surrey, this sense of unfairness and unjustness in the wider system is going to be less acute. So, but if you're talking in, say, sort of Scunthorpe or Boston, where people feel they're getting a real raw deal from Britain and the country, then I would really lean into the fairness side of things and how you address that. So I guess that you shouldn't necessarily be using different messages, but there's perhaps different emphasis on how much you lean into the different points, depending on those attributes. Have you got any examples of successful community benefits packages? Um, um, I personally don't, although I was on a discussion the other day and someone actually mentioned, to give you an example of uh, how random the community benefits can be, in that. So I don't know whether this is the case, but this is what people told me. So someone who's more local expertise. So the Lower Thames Crossing in Dartford/Kent has real local concern, and the community benefit that really actually commanded support was that there was the installation of high-speed broadband to the local people, because I think Vodafone had a real strong interest in having the Thames crossing being built. So actually, offering them the installation of high-speed broadband and 5G was one of the most successful forms of community benefit there. So the conclusion I would therefore lead and reinforce with you is that actually, community benefit is going to very much depend on what the local circumstances are, and it can be very illogical because one might argue that the construction of the Lower Thames Crossing doesn't necessitate the need for impact broadband or high-speed connectivity, but that's the thing that really apparently commanded the most support among people. So basically, to answer the question, I can't necessarily personally pinpoint that. I'm hoping to do some research where we will test this quantitatively and do some experiments on that. So to basically show them different types of community benefits and see in choice-based experiments which best mitigate concerns to the development. But we're looking for a partner for that. So if you'd like to do a bit more research on that, then please get in touch with me as well, because we'd love to do that. So we've got another question here, which is planning can only deal with mitigation. Community benefit is voluntary on the part of a developer/infrastructure provider. Does your research identify if this is understood across the public, and how can that be explained given some people's apathy to local institutions? So I mean, I hold some policy expertise here, but I, I'm, yeah. I mean, you might know the answer better than me there, but I think a key part of development is that they have to agree some form of community benefit as part of receiving planning consent. But I'll leave someone else who's got more expertise on that to come back on that. But on your point about how you can whether it's understood amongst the public, I would say you ask a very good question about how can you mitigate apathy? Because basically, the public think that developers are going to take the council for a ride, and if not worse, they think the council are getting backhanders from the developers. So, understanding apathy, addressing apathy at the local institution is extremely important. And I think people do not understand how the planning process works at all. So please do not come from a starting perspective of how the planning process works. That's not the case at all. So how can you address this? I would suggest that developers and councils, because I imagine it's in developers' interest to mitigate local opposition to these developments. Front and center has to be the community benefit, and they can't be seen as like a nice to have or an extra or something that you'll get, a carrot to dangle in front of local people. It's got to be seen as one part of the package. So I would implore local authorities working with developers to make it one package with the infrastructure and the development and the benefits, not the infrastructure and then maybe the developments. So I think that's really important. And I think the most important way to address apathy about local institutions, as I said earlier, is to give local people control over the community benefits, because they'll say, look, I don't trust the council to do this effectively, but if you give us X number of pounds for our local community, set up a local community forum or a residents association to feed into, That's how you deal with mitigate concern, because people feel like they know how to decide where money should go, and to ensure it's spent properly and not, given to friends of friends or backhanders much more effectively in the council. So, as policy experts, you can question whether the public are right in that view, but there's a clear, strong consensus from a public opinion perspective. So, yeah, so to answer your question, it's got to be about making it one package. And then second of all, it's got to be about giving local people as much ownership of the community benefits scheme as possible as well. So I don't think there's any further questions. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat now. I'll leave a minute or so for you to do so. If not, I think we'll call it a day, and we'll be distributing the slides after the report. So you'll have this for reference. And my email will be on the slides, but I'll just put this in the chat as well for you, because if you'd like to talk about this in more detail, or to think about how we could do some more quantitative analysis of this, then please do get in touch, because I'd love to do so, because it was one of my favorite projects I've done here at Morecambe Commons. So I don't think we have any questions, so I'm going to call the webinar to an end now. But if you do have any questions, please reach out to us, and I look forward to chatting to you. And thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime. So thank you.